I've openly admitted a few times that yes, even I once stopped watching The Walking Dead at one point. But even during that time that I stopped watching, one thing remained constant, and that's my undying love for Rick Grimes. So when Andrew Lincoln announced that he would be leaving during season 9 of the show, I had to come back and at least see how Officer Friendly went out. And AMC made sure to let everybody know that these were the final episodes of Rick Grimes. All of season 9 was marketed towards that premise, and even though he's only in 5 episodes of the season, his face is still front and center on all the posters, because I think even AMC kind of thought that once Rick is gone, the show and fanbase was probably gonna go with him. And by all means, that's exactly what should have happened. Season 7 and 8 made a few too many mistakes. The fans were leaving in droves, and Rick Grimes, the main character and face of the franchise, was now also leaving. The grave was basically already dug, waiting to be put to rest, but rather ironically, the show didn't die. In a last-ditch effort to try and bring some new life to the show, Scott Gimple was promoted somehow, and Angela Kang was brought in as showrunner. With the season fighting such an uphill battle, trying to recover from the mistakes of the 2 previous seasons, having the star of the show leave, and give the show a new beginning, the odds were basically insurmountable. And even just saying all this out loud, I have absolutely no idea how this season actually ended up being, in my opinion, one of the greatest in the whole universe of The Walking Dead. So in this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the final episodes of Rick Grimes, and how this season actually bounced back and made The Walking Dead enjoyable to watch once again. So raise your Colt Python and find your family, because we're talking about The Walking Dead Season 9. So like I said, AMC went full on with the marketing around Rick's departure from the show. They didn't even try to sugarcoat anything. They were like, he's going to be in 5 episodes, and I remember watching the broadcast of the 5th and final episode, and there was this big dramatic, and now, here is Rick Grimes' final episode. It was this huge event that they were building up, and for the most part, I think they nailed it, but before we get to that episode, let's talk about the previous 4. The first episode is titled A New Beginning, which is a very in-your-face way of AMC telling the audience, you know, all that stuff that you didn't like about season 7 and 8, yeah, that's done now, we're starting fresh. And that truly is a promise that they delivered on in these 5 episodes. These first 5 episodes really broke the mold that The Walking Dead had gotten so accustomed to. Find a home, find a villain, battle, leave home to find a new one, rinse and repeat. This was the first time that their home wasn't abandoned, and Alexandria, along with all the other new communities, stood intact. There was no major villain in these episodes, everything was about trying to live alongside each other and the drama that came with it. And quite honestly, this 5-episode stretch is some of my favorite Walking Dead ever. Rick has entered a new era. The murder jacket is put away, he has a new haircut and looks far older than he has any right to look, especially since 10 years from now, he looks way younger. I saw a comment the other day and I thought it was very appropriate. Rick in season 9 is in his Yoda era. He's old and wise, and everybody looks to him for answers, despite a few people around him with other plans. I really love seeing how hard Rick works to keep everybody in check, including his very best pals like Daryl and Maggie, who aren't exactly happy with the way that things have played out since they won the war. You can really feel the tension between the communities and the ex-saviors, and there's this air of suspense and caution because it really feels like everything is hanging on by a thread. They're trying to create a new beginning, sure, but all of this is really just one bad day away from imploding. And stuff does go wrong. The ex-saviors pick fights with people, everyday chores and work get difficult because of the walkers, the construction of the bridge is incredibly difficult because of all the different ideals surrounding it, and Rick is really the guy keeping all of this together. Rick tells Negan that even though there are bad days, they're gonna get through them, and Negan kinda doubts that, and in the end, he actually ends up right about it. There are, of course, some other prominent storylines besides Rick, namely Maggie and Daryl being upset with how everything has been handled and wanting to take things into their own hands. Maggie, of course, wants revenge against Negan. Him rotting in a cell for the rest of his life isn't good enough for her, and Daryl is on the same page. It took me until this rewatch to be like, wait, why is Daryl on the same page as Maggie? Daryl is upset with Rick about his role at the Sanctuary because Daryl doesn't want to be a leader of any kind. He's still angry with how the decisions to include the Saviors have gone down, especially since he sees sides to them that Rick doesn't see. But all of this seems pretty surface level to me. On a deeper level, I feel like Daryl still holds a grudge against not only Negan, but all of the Saviors for his pain and torture during Season 7. And even beyond that, Daryl still feels responsible for Glenn's death, so to pair him up with Maggie on the quest for revenge is a really great storyline and makes for some great scenes with Rick and Daryl at odds with each other. Jadis is also a pretty big character in these 5 episodes, getting close with Father Gabriel, and this ends up being a pretty impactful and important relationship even a ways down the road. While these episodes are primarily focused on Rick for obvious reasons, there's also a good amount of seeds being planted here for the time he's gone. Like I said, Rick is the person that's holding all of these communities together, and it's only hanging on by a thread. When he's gone, none of this lasts. Daryl doesn't want to be a leader, and that was really emphasized in these episodes because it would have been really easy to just give Daryl all of Rick's storylines from here on out and make him Rick 2.0, but that doesn't happen either. And now, we talk about
Rick Grimes' last episode.
This episode is pretty damn good. It also broke the only important stuff happens in episodes 1, 8, 9, and 16 structure that the previous seasons had been using pretty egregiously. I've gone more in depth about this episode in another analysis, but this episode has just about everything you could want from Rick Grimes' final episode. We get flashbacks of Shane and Herschel and Sasha because they couldn't get Steven Yeun back. And all of these, particularly the scene with Herschel, are incredibly powerful and emotional. Rick gets some final axe kills and a hero moment blowing up the bridge, and it's all very meaningful and symbolic. Daryl stands by Rick one last time, essentially taking the torch as the show's new leading man. The bridge that took all of Rick's influence and power to get built as a way to bring the communities together is destroyed, along with any hope for the future. And of course, they weren't actually going to kill off Rick Grimes, so they had him defy the laws of physics, be blown somehow into the water, and he gets charted off in a helicopter with the promise that we'll see him again in a Rick Grimes movie trilogy. Oh boy, I can't wait to watch that. This is also the final episode for a very long time for Maggie, although that was kept a secret until after this episode aired, maybe not to take away from Rick's spotlight, but also if they were like, yeah, so actually 2 main characters are gone after this. That might have turned even more people away, so they just kept that one a secret. But she also goes through a great story arc in these 5 episodes, from wanting to take matters into her own hands and become some ruthless leader, to realizing that Rick's plan was right all along. Daryl also comes to a similar conclusion, but they're never actually able to tell Rick this, which is another really tragic part of the episode. And to end the episode off, we get a Marvel-esque scene teasing the rest of the season with grown-up Judith and a new cast of characters. So these 5 episodes are basically a mini season of their own, but I also think that the way they handled all of this was incredibly smart. If this had gone to the mid-season finale, with the long break in between everything, that would have been sayonara for a lot of fans. But there was still 3 more episodes, which is 3 episodes to hook your audience on whatever new story you're telling, and they definitely did that. This reminds me a lot of when Michael Scott left The Office, and they did the same thing there. They didn't have his final episode be the finale because then a year break might just dissuade people from watching the next season. They wanted people to see how the show would continue without this main character, and by doing so, they still kept a large portion of the audience. But losing Rick had a lot of in-world consequences, and I absolutely love how everything was handled in this Rickless World. The writers had a few different avenues to go down. There was the easiest route, which is just what I said earlier, make Daryl Rick 2.0, have him realize that he actually does need to step up and he does need to be a leader and take Rick's place. And I'm quite frankly a little surprised that they didn't do that, but I'm glad they didn't, because no matter what, Daryl isn't Rick. Even if Daryl is a leader, his leading style is not Rick's style. Daryl isn't going to give a big rallying speech. He might quietly inspire those around him, but he's not going to be the guy to hype everybody up. Some people don't take to his style of leadership, and that's fine because that's entirely in line with who Daryl is. So while Daryl took over as the lead character, he still remained true to who he was. The writers didn't change him for this season, but because they did this, they also had to change a lot about the upcoming storylines. So how did they do this? They introduced a whole lot of mystery and a time jump. We get very little context about the past in this time jump, although clearly a lot of things worked out well for everybody in these 6 years because everybody's still alive and well. But also, the group and Rick's found family have never been further apart. People like Michonne and Carol are barely on speaking terms anymore. There's all this mystery around what actually went down between the communities, and that's certainly explored later in the season, but it makes for a really intriguing storyline that we want to see the answers to. Throw in the scars on both Michonne and Daryl, and we have even more reasons to stick around. But mainly what all of this does is cement how much of an impact Rick had on all of these people, and how the writers were really respecting his departure with all these decisions while still making the show interesting to watch, mainly because Rick is no longer around and how different things have become without him. It's incredibly smart writing and really well done by the showrunner and the writers, and I know this season gets a lot of credit, but I still think it deserves more because of just how many obstacles this season had to overcome to be as good as it is. However, not all of the writing decisions were great writing decisions. So let's talk about the introduction of this whole new group of people. A lot of people refer to them as Magna's group, which seems appropriate for season 9 because Magna really does seem like the leader in this season, until she goes on to do absolutely nothing for the rest of the series. I suppose a lot of my criticisms for this group comes from seasons 10 and 11, so I'll get to my issues with them there, but in this season, I don't really have too big of a problem with any of them individually. One of my favorite storylines to come out of this time jump is the friendship between Judith and Negan. Seeing all these relationships wavering in the time jump, it's also nice to see one that's thriving and how different Negan is after all these years in his cell. He's still a pompous ass, but we see more than ever just how fake his whole persona is, because when he's talking with Judith, that's the real Negan, and all these years in the cell has forced him to lower his guard quite a bit. This time jump also allowed the show to change identities. There's very little ammunition, so everybody is taken more kindly to melee weapons and bows. All of the fuel they find must go towards Daryl's bike, even though the fuel probably shouldn't even be good anymore, but Daryl needs to have his bike, so just go with it. They use horses and carriages to get around now. The music went from really dramatic synthwave to more classic western, and all of these changes offered up new ways to tell the story. There's also plenty of changes to the characters, like Eugene just now being a total badass, Aaron looking like a comic book version of Rick Grimes, Rosita and Father Gabriel being together, long-haired Carol, and a lot of this stuff is just kind of glanced over, as it would be in universe, because these people have evolved since the last time we saw them. And speaking of things evolving in this universe, there's a reason why the story picks up 6 years later and not in between when everything was all sunshine and rainbows. And that's because there's a little something different about the walkers now. They're moving a little bit differently now, apparently whispering to each other. It seems that instead of rotting away completely, the walkers have evolved into something more frightening. The music is eerie, the tone surrounding the walkers changes into something more threatening and menacing once again, and I really liked how this whole introduction to the Whisperers was done. This aspect brought horror back to The Walking Dead and back to the walkers, something that had been missing for quite some time. The whole episode, Evolution, is really well done in terms of bringing the horror back to The Walking Dead, but it's also a victim of one of The Walking Dead's biggest problems, and that's the highlighting of a character in the episode you're gonna kill them off in. I knew pretty early into the episode, without getting spoiled. I watched this episode as it aired, with it being a mid-season finale and all, that Jesus was gonna be killed off. He was given way too much focus, especially being talked about as some new political leader of Hilltop and being promised a bigger role going forward. Same things happened with Noah and Denise and even Glenn to a certain extent, so Jesus' death was pretty obvious to me. The actual death scene and reveal of the Whisperers is really well done, but why couldn't this have been like any of the new characters besides Connie? It would have brought that group closer to our primary group and saved Jesus to have a more prominent role. I suppose they wanted to Shock to be more of a big deal, and this was back when the show would actually kill off its main characters, something that they outright refuse to do now, so I guess I gotta give it a pass. But this reveal of people using the walkers to blend in and move around is a really great choice for the next villain of this series, especially with there being a time jump of 6 years in the future. You either still want to cling on to the society that you knew before the apocalypse, or you adapt to the world as it is now, and this parallel between these two sides gets greater as the season moves on. I like the Whisperers a lot as villains, both in the show and the comics. I think they're really creepy, particularly in this season, and brought in an exciting new element to the show overall. Being able to manipulate what is the biggest army on the planet against the survivors is a really great avenue that the show got to explore, and I think for this season it was handled really well. The Whisperers, of course, end up bringing the groups back together, setting aside their differences, and also planning a party to secure the relationship between the communities. And whenever there's some big event planned like this in any TV show, you just know that when that day comes,
it's about to go down.
But things really get underway when the group finds Lydia. The whole dilemma with this group, mainly Daryl, wanting to save this young girl from her mother and the Whisperers as a whole, presents a really interesting conflict between the Whisperers and the survivors. On one hand, if they just hand Lydia over to the Whisperers, they might just be left alone to what is quite possibly the most dangerous enemy they've ever faced. On the other hand, Daryl's a big ol' softy on the inside, and he wants to save this girl. And our group really isn't comfortable with giving this girl up, or what to do in this situation. It's at this time the absence of Rick Grimes really feels big to me, but almost in a good way. Taking the comics away from this whole storyline, because the stories deviate quite a bit from here on out between the comics and the show, and taking away what Rick does in the comics, it's times like this where everybody looked to Rick on what to do. He would have a definitive answer, one way or another. No, we're not giving you the girl, so bring it on. Or yeah, sure, you can have her, now leave us alone. But because nobody is really comfortable with this decision or how to handle the Whisperers, we get the rest of the season to play out the way it does. Of course, one of the biggest characters in this season is Henry, and I feel like he gets a bit more hate than is necessary. I never really had a problem with Henry personally. Yes, it was very obvious that he was the replacement Carl with his entire storyline with Lydia, and Carl being gone still left a sour taste in people's mouths, so when you have this new teenager who gets a lot of screen time, gets all of comic Carl storylines, it's easy to look at him and be like,
you're supposed to be Carl, but you're not, and I hate you for it.
But as a character overall, I don't mind Henry. I've expressed before how I don't really care for any of the teenager-centric storylines in this show, and that definitely continues with this season. I just don't think the writers knew how to write teenagers in general. It's not even like CW quality, it's below that because it feels even more fake, if that makes sense to anyone. But I do feel like Henry is an important character in this season. He's a big reason why the Lydia conflict becomes so interesting and important. He's an important character to the people around him that we do like, and that's usually a way to get the audience to like that character too. Speaking of which, let's talk about Magna's group once again. The writers do their best to give each character some personality and integrate them with our group of survivors in an organic way, and I feel like with this season they actually do a fine job with that. But one of these characters shines far brighter than the rest, and that, of course, is Connie. Say what you want about how unrealistic it is for a deaf person to survive the zombie apocalypse, it makes for some good drama, which at the end of the day is what The Walking Dead is. And a big reason why the audience grew to love and care for Connie above all the others is because of her connection with Daryl. Later on in this season, Daryl goes on a mission to save Henry, and Connie insists that she go with him. Daryl is the lone wolf and doesn't want her to come at first, but throughout their journey, Daryl better learns how to communicate with her, and this mission ends up being a strong bonding point between these two characters for a friendship that lasts to the end of the series. And once again, you pair new characters with old characters that we know and love, get the old character to care for the new character, and it's a very easy way for the audience to start caring for that person too. But you see, Connie is really the only member of this new group to do that. Later on, some other attempts are made at integrating the others, but Connie, in my opinion, is really the only one that sticks, and a big part of that is because of this season and her friendship with Daryl. How it seems like they had a plan for this relationship to grow organically and actually had a plan for Connie. This whole storyline also leads us to the Daryl versus Beta scene, which is a pretty cool scene. In the final part of the season, Lydia officially joins the group, and everybody more or less accepts her as one of their own. And with the fair coming at the kingdom, this giant event that is supposed to reunite all the communities since their implosion because of Rick's departure, all seems well. So let's flash back to sometime after the disappearance of Rick, with Daryl searching for Rick's body and a pregnant Michonne in the episode Scars. Now, this is an episode that I'm not too sure why it only has a 7.9, because I think this is a pretty great, but also pretty horrific episode of television, in the same way that The Grove is a pretty great, but pretty horrific episode of television. But this episode answers some questions we had about how the communities broke up in the first place, and of course, why Daryl and Michonne have those scars. I'm usually not a big fan of flashback episodes whatsoever. I think they're generally a lazy way to interrupt the pacing of a story and just explain a lot of unnecessary details, but with this episode, I make an exception. Maybe because it's a flashback episode that is so deep into a story and it comes after a significant time jump, but overall, I think that this is a great episode of The Walking Dead. Not too sure what everybody's gripe with it is, so if you don't like this episode, please let me know why that is in the comments below. So after what is a really heavy and dark episode of the show, we move on to the next episode. Surely this episode will be much lighter since it's about the happy fair that they've all been planning for the past 7 episodes. Let's see here. Oh right, this episode is called The Calm Before. There's a false sense of happiness covering this whole episode. All members of the group are on good terms again, they sign the treaty, and it's just like old times. The scenes feel incredibly uplifting and joyous, but something just doesn't feel right. It reminds me quite a bit of the final few episodes of The Clone Wars. They seemingly won the battle and captured Maul. They're all celebrating and the tone is uplifting, but the music doesn't match the scenes whatsoever. It's warning you that it's not over and that something drastic is coming, and that's exactly what The Calm Before does too. The Whisperers interfere with the fair, Alpha blending in and talking to our characters, and if you've read the comics, or at least know who dies in the comics, there's a ton of misdirection in this episode for who is actually going to be the Pike victims. The reveals are slow and methodical, the music is heart-wrenching and horrific, and of course, Carol can never be happy in this series, so she loses yet another child who looks at her as their mother. Regardless of how everybody feels about Henry, his death is tragic and is the mic drop death of this episode and season. This episode proved that The Walking Dead still had it, and while all of these deaths are shocking, there's actually proper setup for them in this episode. And it feels like there's more of a reason for all these people dying, particularly Henry, than the deaths in the past where they just needed to kill somebody for the sake of shock value. This episode deserves to be on the top 10 episodes list, and this episode caps off what has been an emotionally draining season. And now we want to see just how our group comes back from this. Oh wait, there's still another episode. The last episode, titled The Storm, is supposed to be both literal and metaphorical, although it kind of feels more literal because there's actually a snowstorm in this episode, which is entirely new for The Walking Dead. Anytime it's been winter, they just skip right over it with a time jump, so this was new territory for The Walking Dead, and anytime that happens, you gotta give them credit for at least trying. What I really like about the finale is how traumatized the group is from the events of the previous episode. Carol blames Lydia for what happened to Henry, even though she knows it's not really her fault, but she can't really help but feel she's to blame anyways. There's no one to really take the reins and say, alright, it's time for payback, so everybody just kind of follows the rules that Alpha has set in place until they can't do that anymore and have to venture into their territory. And even without seeing them, the Whisperers feel very threatening. You don't know if they're watching, how all of this is going to play out, and if there's one thing that this season really got right, it's that horror aspect, because the Whisperers really do feel like a major threat. Negan also takes on a bigger role in this finale, once again being an ass around the group and getting under the skin of everybody that he can, but his true colors come out when he risks his own life to save Judith. And again, a lot of this feels this way because of the absence of Rick Grimes. If Rick was here, one way or another, he'd have a plan of revenge, a plan to keep peace, whatever it would be, depending on what version of Rick we would get, but without him, the group is kinda aimless. Maybe my love for Rick kinda clouds my judgment on the rest of the characters in this season, but I've always viewed this season with the lens of, what would Rick do if he were here? And because he's not, it makes the characters and their decisions that much more impactful. Again, taking the comics and what happens there out of it, I feel like the show version of Rick would have handled this entire Whisperer situation very differently. So without him around, without a concrete leader around, the season plays out much differently because of it. He might only be in 5 episodes of the season, but his absence plays a much larger role than anything else. But you can only go so far with the what would Rick do lens, and they can't exactly keep that up for the rest of the series, so somebody needs to step up and take charge, and that's exactly what happens in Season 10. I'm gonna give The Walking Dead Season 9 an 8.6 out of 10. What are your thoughts on The Walking Dead Season 9? Let me know in the comments below, and if you're watching this video live or within the first few hours, then happy Halloween! I know this Season 9 video took a bit of time. It's because I got a bit sidetracked with rewatching The Walking Dead because of another very time-consuming project that I'll hopefully have out before the end of the year. But with there being 2 more months in the year, Seasons 10 and 11 will come out in November and December respectively, so keep an eye out for those. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more stuff like this, including a video on Season 2 of Daryl Dixon, and I'll see you all in the next one.
Call the sleepers from your